Good morning, everyone. Very pleased to be here this morning. And I have an esteemed panel here with me to kick off today's sessions. As you would have heard earlier this morning by Ms. Loy, the region presents huge potential for carbon services and carbon trading. And very happy to have the three gentlemen here today to share some of the views. I think they need no introduction. So maybe we should just kick off with a question across the panel to Mr. Teo, Mr. Kalafatas, and Mr. Lim. So first question, Southeast Asia, obviously we talk about its potential and the potential opportunities in the space. What are some of the key projects that you see in this region today? Maybe Mr. Teo, could I have you?
Sure. Southeast Asia is actually home to a lot of natural capital. So about 15% of the world's nature-based potential is actually in this region. So clearly, nature-based solutions and projects that can help with decarbonization will be a clear, important priority. But beyond that, it is also important to consider tech solutions, whether it is in terms of biofuels and other forms of clean energy transition solutions, because ultimately, for us to achieve net zero, you need to achieve fundamental industrial decarbonization. So in combination, I think it offers quite a lot of interesting projects for many developers, investors, and operating companies to pursue.
Thank you. I'd love to wind around to that answer and first just convey my gratitude to EDB for the opportunity. I co-founded 3 Degrees 22 years ago, and with the help of a lot of other people, have built the organization into one of the leading global decarbonization firms. And we've been doing work in Asia for the last 10 years. Some people might not know that we put together a 500 rooftop, 50 megawatt solar PPA aggregation, the first ever PPA done here in Singapore. And that work rolls on with 100 megawatts under construction today and more solicitations in the environment. On the carbon side, we're very proud to be investing more here in ASEAN. As an organization, we've been developing methane management projects in the United States for 15 years now, and in addition, have been working through third-party partners to procure carbon credits in the region, including occasionally, and in China, from our friends at Climate Bridge. As we look at the environment, and as Fred mentioned, we see a lot of competency around nature-based solutions and an opportunity for us to leverage this very core competency that we have around methane management, whether from waste from humans, from animals, from industrial process, or agriculture, to unlock the potential of the region.
Wonderful. Firstly, thanks so much for having me here today. I'm Alvin, the CEO and co-founder of Climate Bridge International, a new Singapore headquartered joint venture with Climate Bridge Group. Founded in 2006, Climate Bridge Group is one of China's largest independent carbon project developer. Over the past 18 years, we've developed over 500 tech and nature-based carbon projects and delivered over 100 million tons of carbon credits. We seek to bridge knowledge, capital, and technology to help transition into a low-carbon economy. Or you kind of, just to answer your question, I'll break it up into two parts. I think if we take a longer-term view, there are two technologies that I think are really going to move the needle for Southeast Asian decarbonization. The first one is the transition from coal to renewable energy, possibly through initiatives like traction here and the use of transition credits. The second one is the restoration and preservation of our agriculture and forest land, especially in Southeast Asia, which is home to some of the largest carbon sinks in the world. That's a long-term view. But if I were to take a shorter-term view over the next 5 years, say to 2030, I actually kind of agree with what Dan mentioned. Some of the near-term emission reduction opportunities are in things like methane reduction. So here I'm talking about landfill gas, municipal solid waste, animal manure, community biodigesters. 2, in refrigerant destruction, so CFC. And 3, in e-mobility, so the transition from ICE to EVs in Southeast Asia. Those, I think, are the near-term opportunities.
Thanks, Alvin. I think what's been very interesting also in talking through the different perspectives and different types of projects, but actually Southeast Asia is also not a homogeneous region. And surely there must be some differences between operating and looking at projects within this region versus outside of Southeast Asia, for example, China or the US or other regions. And perhaps each of the panelists here could share with us a little bit where do you see the differences are and potentially what are the challenges in operating in Southeast Asia relative to other regions?
Actually, beyond just looking at differences, maybe it's a question of degree. So when Alvin was mentioning this issue around coal transition, it is a problem that is particularly important for this region because Southeast Asia is one of the fastest growing regions when it comes to coal expansion. So while many other regions are still also, especially developing countries, are still grappling with this issue, developed countries have actually gone slightly beyond that because over the past 20, 25 years, there's generally about a halving of their coal fleet. But in Southeast Asia, there is still a tremendous expansion. So actually, when it comes to, it's not just about differences, it's perhaps a question of relative importance and urgency. That's one. The second thing also is that Southeast Asia is within the equatorial belt. And so therefore, what happens on sea level rises actually affects us disproportionately compared to maybe countries that are further away from the equatorial belt. Because it's a global sea level rise is not homogeneous across the world. And unfortunately, Southeast Asia is a particularly archipelagic region. So most of our populations are actually living close to the sea or close to water, right? So therefore, even when we're thinking about opportunities and differences, it is important to focus not just on the mitigation efforts where much of the carbon projects are actually focused on right now, but to see the intersections with perhaps adaptation and reliance, right? So if we think about the project that we invested in on rice farming, sustainable rice farming, where we are encouraging farmers to adopt alternate wetting and drying practices. Now, these practices have been around for a long time, right? It's not new. The idea is you don't want to have continuous flooding of the paddy fields to have methane emissions. But why did the farmers now start to actually embrace AWD? And when I was doing a field visit to India, some of the farmers were telling me it is mainly because the rainfall has actually halved over the past few years. And so if they don't change and pivot, then there is actually a food security problem, there is a livelihood problem for them. So actually when we think about the opportunity set in Southeast Asia, it is also about focusing on some of these things where there is an intersection between mitigation and adaptation.
So I think what I reinforce that the region is incredibly balkanized as a global developer of projects. When we look at the area with different, I'm going to say things you all know, different languages, different legal structures, state actors, et cetera. And that, of course, speaks to the theme of harmonization, which we've discussed this morning. But beyond that, for us, it really speaks to the need to co-create with talent, local talent, that's really well trained. And I don't want them to get too overconfident, but we've been delighted with the team that we've had in the market here, where we're able to bring global practices that have been implemented in the United States, in Europe, and in other continents, and then customize them and adapt them to the region. And so we really celebrate what Singapore is doing to cultivate that talent and hope to do our part on that front as well. I think there's two really big opportunities in the differences in the region. The first is Scope 3. The world's been focused on Scope 3 for a long time. We've been focused on that as well, and many of those roads lead here to this region, which is an incredible opportunity. And I think it's worth saying in this moment where people talk so much about potentially equivocating voluntary corporate demand, to share what we're seeing, which is, while some language is coming off of websites, the modern version of green hushing, that behind closed doors, the companies that have been committed are as committed as ever, and we're seeing actions to back the words. I'm talking about signed agreements. And so I think there'll be sustaining interest in insetting, in supply chain interventions, which is a real advantage in the difference to the area. And then finally, as an American, I will say that US uncertainty is Asians' opportunity. And I think there's incredible opportunity in this today. In the United States, we're coming out of an era with significant incentives for capital formation around these issues. And that has certainly changed. And as a result, the region's in an incredible position to capture the investment dollars by organizations from a risk-adjusted return perspective. And that's certainly how we looked at the decision to build out our office here. We're grateful for EDB for the support to help influence that risk-adjusted return, because the region's competing against opportunities around the world. And it was successful at changing our focus, and I think has great potential to do the same for corporations around the globe.
Yeah, I think for me, if I look at some of the differences between the global carbon markets and those in Southeast Asia, I kind of narrow it down into three things. First is the regulatory certainty of the environment we operate. Two is the talent, which many have already mentioned. And three is the scalability of projects. If we look in markets like Europe and the US, there's a lot more regulatory certainty on the use of project-based credits in those compliance markets. A good example is the California carbon market, which allows the use of project-based carbon credits in that scheme. Singapore has taken a step forward here, now allowing up to 5% of international carbon credits for use in our Singapore compliance tax. But it would be great to see Southeast Asia as a whole start moving in the same direction where there's greater convergence of both projects into compliance market. The second one is maybe talent. Carbon markets have existed for over 20 years, but where there is a lot of project development capability is actually in places like China, India, and the US, because those markets have had a history of developing carbon projects either for compliance market or for project-based carbon markets. So we take an example. We look at this clean development mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol. The largest supplier of CDM credits was actually China into the EU emission trading system 10 years ago. And therefore, it is companies like Climate Bridge Group in China that has the experience, together with 3Degree, nearly 20 years of experience developing carbon projects. How can we in Southeast Asia then, by contrast, kind of learn from them, to work with them, bring the partner into Singapore and into the region, and then also through some of the initiatives at a local institute of higher learning to develop capabilities at the undergraduate, graduate, and then retool and reskill kind of the executives in the mid-stage. The last one I'll highlight is maybe the scalability of project. If I look, for example, within Climate Bridge Group in China, a lot of the project sponsors are actually state-owned enterprises and large corporations. And therefore, they are both bankable from a credit perspective, but they also have multiple projects allowing project developers to scale alongside the asset owners. In Southeast Asia, asset owners are only just now starting to become familiar with carbon finance and are looking at how carbon revenue streams can augment otherwise uneconomical, low-carbon projects. Right? So there's greater fragmentation and it's harder to scale for us. One solution to this, I think, is to see ASEAN as a bloc come together to mutually recognize carbon crediting programs, methodologies, and projects such that credits that are generated from the region can then be used in a growing number of compliance carbon markets in the Asia-Pacific.
Yeah. On that particular one, I think there are some initiatives right now in ASEAN, like for example, the ASEAN Core Carbon Framework, ACCF, which was launched at the last COP, which is an attempt by at least 4 countries as a start, Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, to try and harmonize our regulatory approaches or standards to do with the carbon markets. But on that one point, I think it is important that we make a distinction between having national regulation and having national standards. So I think one of the things that Alvin is alluding to is the importance of actually recognizing international standards even as you regulate nationally. Because you cannot imagine that if all the different countries have their own different definitions of how to do a restoration, reforestation project, or a landfill project, or a mangrove project, it will actually increase the compliance cost and the complexity of execution. So it will be a little bit of a deterrence, I would imagine, for project sponsors, investors, developers to actually come in and develop projects here in Southeast Asia. And more importantly, there is also a question of acceptability to international programs. So if we want to have the credits from Southeast Asia acceptable, say in compliance markets in the West or in Japan or Korea and elsewhere, then it is very important that we actually subscribe to an international standard that most people can actually recognize and accept.
Could I build on that?
Yeah.
Okay, great. From a carbon project developer's perspective, it's terrifying to have a single point of failure with respect to the underlying demand that you're seeking to serve. And this can be at the regime, the regulatory, the compliance level. I think back to the Kyoto Protocol and prices coming way down and versions of that in California over its long history regulated climate and renewable energy outcomes. And so the end goal is to create a nexus of 2 things. A regulatorily driven robust market that's a collection of national, regional, and international demand, providing resiliency and optionality across harmonized protocols, and a robust voluntary market. together. That's where the demand sources are disparate. I've been told over my career, I've learned over my career building companies, that there's two problems from a company perspective that you have. Do you have customers, and all other problems? And so that idea of customers applies to compliance regimes here as well as the voluntary market. And I haven't heard as much emphasis on trying to use Singapore's leverage and insight and relationships to influence the creation of compliance regimes across the region. I think that's critical to create the outcome, which is durable, reliable pricing and demand across regimes to unlock the potential of the region.
Maybe then actually to that point, the Asia-Pacific region as a whole has probably more markets today that are allowing the convergence of project-based credits into compliance markets. If we look at China, for example, China's emissions is about 10 gigaton, of which by the end of this decade, hopefully 8 gigatons will be included. 5% of the national ETS of the 8 gigaton can then allow the use of China-certified emission reductions. So carbon credits that are generated from China within the Chinese program, that's 400 million tons of demand. That's just China. We see the same happening with the GX League program using J credits and JCM, in South Korea with CDM credits, in Singapore with international carbon credits, in Australia with ACU. These are all project-based markets that have somehow converged into compliance markets. If we can get ASEAN, I think as a bloc, or Asia Pacific, to move in this direction and to potentially even increase the percentage of carbon credits that can be used in compliance program, that creates price certainty, right? Stable demand, a regulated market. This gives project developers, I think, more confidence to then invest in this market and then bring in institutional capital.
But part of it, I think, is also having the current existing large compliance markets, for example, in Europe, open themselves up to actually international carbon credits from other parts of the world. You imagine, like, for a while now, the ETS is not quite open to this. But I think that there are signs that that's shifting. So there is a momentum towards allowing for tech-based removal credits and all that from other parts of the world. Now, why is this important? Because if you imagine that it is not just about getting lower cost environmental attribute products into the market, but it is also a way of transferring financing from, say, developed markets that typically will have the compliance kind of a program to developing countries where they typically are the source of some of these credits. Now, rather than giving out grants, overseas development, this could potentially be a win-win way of driving finance from developed to developing countries in a more standardized way, right? And with rules and applications that are clear. So actually, in a sense, it's not just about Asia developing our own compliance frameworks and markets, but also asking, is there the possibility that developed markets with compliance frameworks can open themselves up to accepting credits from the developing world as well?
Well, that's a question for, I think, a good question for Alvin, to talk a little bit about project financing and where do you see some of the key gaps, and how you think that we, the collective we, can bring different sources of capital to support that in the region?
Sure. Actually, when I look at financing carbon projects, it's not that different from financing. The challenges that we face here is not that different from what we see in financing other low carbon infrastructure projects. Generally, there are 3 stages to project financing. In the first stage, we're talking about financing needed for feasibility studies and pilot programs. In the second stage, which is where most of the capital is required, we're talking about financing for the deployment and implementation of the project, the purchase of the equipment and the technology. And then we have the third stage, which is after the project has actually issued its first ton of carbon credits and how we can unlock capital for project developers. Broadly speaking, in the market today, there are already mechanisms to address both stage 1 and stage 3. Stage 1, for example, in the earlier stages, government initiatives like the EDB Carbon Project Developer Grant, philanthropic capital and equity from project developers' own balance sheet goes towards funding the feasibility study and the project pilots. In the latter stages, after a project has issued its carbon credit, then we have traditional finance through secured and trade finance that can fund kind of carbon credits developers today. Where we're getting stuck in the market today is in stage 2. This is the financing piece where most capital is required to fund technology and equipment. Right? In my sense, I'm looking for kind of 3 things to make this segment more financeable. The first one is, has the project developer mitigated country and political risks? Second one is the merchant and price risk. And 3 is the project performance risk. So when we look at project developers and even making our own investments, we're saying, does the host country, have they given us the permit and licenses to operate in that country? Are we allowed to develop that, say, program and methodology and project there? And is this host country have the capability and the willingness to provide a letter of authorization under Article 6 for the Article 6 markets, right? If no, is there certain political risk insurance that we can buy to cover for things like the revocation of LOAs? That's the first type of risk that we're looking at. The second thing is offtake or merchant and price risk. Does this project have sufficient fixed price offtake from an investment grade counterparty so that I know if we deliver the project, that the cash flow certainty is high? And then the third piece we're looking at is project performance risk. Here we're assessing project developers and implementation partners' track record in operating the project in the country. And again, potentially, could there be certain insurance that can be bought to mitigate for abandonment of project, delayed delivery, changes in programs and methodologies? Right? I think for projects that are able to meet all these three requirements, they are more likely to be able to move from equity-like financing today to a more infrastructure-like financing. We're able to lever on debt on the project, lower its cost of capital, and then allow projects-based carbon markets to scale. Because today, the project-based carbon markets look a lot more like a venture investment market, where most projects are funded from equity, right? So how can we move towards a more infrastructure-like? And one last piece I'll highlight is actually the role for government, developmental finance institutions, and philanthropic capital is very important at this stage of this market, because this is where they can come in to give us kind of concessionary capital and first loss capital to help de-risk this project a little bit for some of the traditional investors. I think if we're able to do that, we can crowd in some of the traditional investments.
May I just add on to what Alvin is saying? So two perspectives. The first one is actually around the financing piece. So clearly it is important for us to try and get offtake agreements ahead of time, because that reduces the merchant risk and so on and so forth, right? You know that there is a customer, okay? But there is also a dilemma. So for us as an investor, I ask myself, look, how much offtake pre-project will be necessary for me to have the confidence to invest and deploy, okay? Is it like I need 100% of the offtake to be taken up, 50%, 30%? What is the benchmark? Some of our friends say, look, it's got to at least cover your capital outlay, by milestone. Others say, no, I want the whole thing actually de-risked, otherwise I'm not going to put in. Now, what is the dilemma? If the entire project is totally de-risked with 100% offtake, what do you think are the returns that the developers and others are prepared to offer you as an investor? And if the returns are going to be lower because it's fundamentally de-risked, then it comes back to the question that Dan had posed. In many of these developing countries, would it cross my cost of capital? And if it doesn't, then I'm also stuck. So it is not just a straightforward idea that I need to de-risk the entire project totally by having all the offtake totally spoken for, because there is also that trade-off with the returns that then people are prepared to offer you as an investor or a sponsor. Okay, so that's one. And I think secondly, when you think about the other part of the financing, to shift it from equity financing to a bit more debt-like financing, one of the things that we are working on at GenZero is this time around together with PwC, so our teams are actually trying to clarify what exactly is the legal nature of carbon credits. Because the legal status and the accounting treatment for carbon credits is not yet totally defined. So for example, would a contract be sufficient for a bank to say that, okay, I can securitize this is an acceptable collateral, I'm therefore prepared to actually extend debt-like financing to a project? Now, those things actually require us to harmonize and think through properly what exactly is the legal status and accounting treatment for something like carbon credits, which is a newer class of assets.
Dan, I mean, I think we talked a lot about sort of project development and financing and what might be some of the big gaps, but actually there's probably a larger ecosystem and a number of key players and actors that need to come in to make this a lot more robust and really grow the region. What do you think are some of these players that we haven't sort of spoken about here today that are critical to making this work?
Yeah, again, I think through the lens of regulated markets and voluntary markets, and I would love the standing room only talent here to marshal itself to do two things. Number one is to engage with the greenhouse gas protocol. There's really critical rulemaking underway over this year and the next couple years that will define how market-based mechanisms can play in the regime, and in particular on Scope 3 reductions, again, which plays directly into the region's competitive advantage. What I'd love to do is raise awareness around this issue and ask you all to lean in and tell the stories that you can to creating that mechanism, which I think will unlock things over time. Secondly, with respect to protocols and harmonization and construction of these regulatory markets, it's critical that there's insights up front by scientists and environmental organizations to assure the protocols, the environmental veracity of the activities underway, deliver what the policy intentions are beforehand. And the last thing anyone wants is after the fact to realize that wasn't the case. It can undermine the confidence by buyers, and it can undermine the potential of investing in future projects as time goes on. It is so important to get that right, and I really hope that those parties are leaning in here.
And Fred, I mean, maybe just sort of swing back to GenZero and what you've been doing, over the past few years. How are you leveraging Singapore as a hub? How are you leveraging the ecosystem to support or to work with the different partners as you do?
Well, I think several things. I think Singapore, it has, I think, 2 or 3 important attributes for us and advantages operating out of Singapore. One is regulatory certainty. I think you're kind of clear that the government is leaning in on not just the carbon markets specifically, but on the broader climate agenda and the importance of pushing for sustainable development more broadly. That is important. You want to know that the macro direction that you're taking and the longer term investments that you're making will pay off and is correctly aligned. Now, and on the regulatory side, it's not just certainty, but in Singapore, also the potential for innovative approaches to policy making. I'll give you an example. Now, GenZero is a big supporter of the development of sustainable aviation fuel. We've got investments into this space across equipment manufacturers, SAF technology companies, and so on and so forth. Now, the way that Singapore has gone about trying to implement adoption of SAF is not quite like how many others have done it with the imposition of a mandate or with a percentage blend. Because if you impose a percentage blend, then what you have is a problem where the cost is a little bit uncertain. Because if SAF is expensive, you still have to buy it and then fulfill that particular percentage blend mandate. So how Singapore has done it is to say, look, I'm going to take away this price uncertainty and this price problem. So we are going to collect a levy. It will be flat depending on the class of travel and so on and so forth. We collect it on behalf of all the airlines and the passengers. So it's the airport that is doing this. And whatever revenue that you have collected, it will be spent on purchasing SAF for the entire infrastructure, the entire system at Changi Airport. Now, in this way, if SAF becomes very expensive, you'll buy a little bit less. If it becomes much cheaper, you'll buy a little bit more. You take away the entire uncertainty of whether this is going to impose crazy costs on the airlines and on passengers because it is known upfront. But nevertheless, doing this will give a bit of certainty on the demand. And that is important for investors like us to have a read on whether there will be at least this level of regulated demand in a way that is also commercially sensible. So on the regulatory side, that's one. And two, I think you can see around the room that there is an ecosystem developing because of the more encouraging or helpful environment that's being created here in Singapore. So within a very small area, I can talk to developers, I can talk to bankers, I can talk to financial institutions, people who want to buy, policy makers, and international industry players who are often gathered here for a variety of activities and reasons. So this entire idea of being able to hub people, bringing people in contact with one another, being able to speak to one another and share perspectives, and then find ways to collaborate is particularly helpful.
Well, I mean, collaboration is very important, both, sort of within the services hub, but also, we talked a lot about compliance and voluntary. And maybe, Alvin, you could share a little bit your thoughts on how would a public-private relationship help to support the ecosystem?
I think I'll go back to one of the points I made earlier around regulatory certainty. I think to the extent that we can encourage further convergence of project-based carbon markets into compliance market and encourage both global compliance markets and regulators to then increase the percentage of carbon credits that are allowed within their compliance market, that I think will help generate more demand for carbon credits and carbon projects. I think in my mind that there is absolutely no way we get to net zero without the use of some project-based interventions, because there will inevitably be some technologies that cannot decarbonize completely. There is also no point in having a carbon price that goes to 1,000, because there are a whole bunch of other interventions that can be put in place before the price gets to 1,000. right? So how can we then promote that convergence a little bit more? And this convergence actually, if successful, kind of will result in three things. I think the first one, it does create a price signal for correspondingly adjusted credit. It then encourages both the buying country and the host country to develop regulations and policy to facilitate the import and exports of carbon credits. The second one is it creates a permanent and regulated demand base, helping accelerate this convergence, channeling capital from high-emitting entities or countries towards lower-emitting technologies and countries. And the last one, it actually reduces some policy risk for project developers. If there is a curation of a list of eligible carbon credits that meets international standards on environmental integrity, that makes our lives a lot easier because then we can go and develop high-integrity project that meets this curated list.
And actually, Dan, you've seen the good and the bad. And maybe from your observations, what are some policy innovations that can support what Alvin is saying? How to drive change?
I think Singapore's off to an excellent start here. I mean, you've heard over the morning so much. At the risk of repeating a point that's been belabored, harmonization. It's really about harmonization and this nexus of demand sources to create the confidence for capital to flow and to have that certainty over time. It really comes back down to that.
In Southeast Asia, one of the things I'm reminded on, earlier on, Oi-Yee, you were asking about what are some of the opportunities and bright sparks. Now, of course, as developers and as investors, we would be prepared to develop projects that are both nature-based, tech-based, and reductions and removals. But I want to make a specific plug also for nature projects that have a community angle. Because much of Southeast Asia is still requiring a lot of financing and support when it comes to development. We are a little bit behind on the developmental journey if you are comparing us to, say, North America, developed parts of Europe. And there are many other developing regions. One way of actually thinking about sustainable development is to think about being able to provide good jobs, being able to help our communities develop in a sustainable way, while at the same time protecting the environment. And there are many of these types of win-win type solutions. I mean, like sustainable agriculture, sustainable forestry are just some of the many examples that we can actually think about. So I think it's also incumbent on us as we are thinking about this, not just to take the pure financial investment lens, but also to think about how we can use capital for good and to actually think about supporting sustainable development in our region.
Maybe I can just add to that, right? Because actually beyond the environmental benefits of creating a robust carbon markets, there is also an economic and job creation benefit. This is true not only for aspiring carbon hubs like those here, but also for countries looking to leverage carbon finance to decarbonize their own economy. So maybe to give you an example, at the Climate Bridge, we're currently looking at a Philippine e-mobility project. This is the conversion of ICE to electric jeepneys. And beyond the environmental aspect of the project, we are also looking to ensure a just transition.
Yeah.
So while this project seeks to modernize transportation cooperatives in the Philippines, we have made an intentional choice to look for equipment suppliers with operations in the Philippines so that this creates good jobs in new industries for Filipinos. Right? I think that is an important kind of co-benefit and a human aspect of developing projects beyond just the economics.
Yeah, which is why when we are thinking about the talent development question and the human capital question, it isn't just purely about talent development solely in the carbon markets. Because we will have to train a new generation of verifiers, carbon accountants, and so on and so forth. And that is the first order type of job requirements. But then as we think about the broader energy transition and other kinds of projects that are being financed by carbon, right, the carbon markets, it is important to be able to make sure that that economic transition across the board is also well looked after. So if you think about like moving from a coal plant to solar panels, then can the jobs actually be repurposed? Because that's one thing that is on our minds as we think about executing that project in the Philippines, right? Will there be jobs? What will happen to the families and the local communities that are actually dependent on these things? So actually, in a sense, we are all called to be social scientists in a broader way, thinking about sustainable development holistically and having a proper theory of change. So we are not just asked to be financial investors, we are not just asked to be technically competent on the carbon, on the reforestation, but actually to be able to think more holistically around sustainable development.
So I see a long list of Q&A from our audience, and we'd really love to have you participate in this session. So I'm going to sort of hop over to the Q&A piece, which I'm sort of reading off the Slido, so if you're keen to throw in a question before we end, please do so. First question for all of you, and it's a very important question, because I ask that question every day as well. The main challenge today is the lack of demand for carbon credits. Please, could we have your views as to, obviously Minister Tan sort of mentioned some of these things, right, in terms of the challenges of harmonization and some of the things that the government is trying to do, but we'd love to hear your respective thoughts as to the lack of demand and perhaps how do we co-create the growth of demand.
I'd love to kick us off here. So Singapore is a shining light on the demand front, and I actually think it's a supply issue right now in the face of the compliance regulation that's taking form in addition to the ones that Alvin has talked about. However, in the absence of more regimes not being in place or tightened goals under those regimes, including using project-based mechanisms to potentially an increasing degree or Article 6 credits, I think we, in say 5 years, could have the opposite situation, which is all of this economic stimulus activity transnationally and then here in the region could create so much supply that pricing drops very, very heavily. So I think it's really critical that people think to that second order outcome economically to keep driving demand as time goes on. What would you add, gentlemen?
Maybe I'll give you 3 parts to this answer, Bill. The first one, where there's a supply shortage. In certain compliance markets that allow the use of project-based credits, there is indeed a supply shortage. An example is China. China allows up to 5% of China's certified emission reduction to be used within the national ETS. That supply pool is extremely limited right now. And as such, actually, the China certified emission, or CCRs, trade at a higher price compared to the national ETS price. This is quite uncommon. Most times where there is a convergence in market, the carbon credits actually trade at a discount. But this is happening because there is a lack of supply, right? The second one I'll highlight is maybe CORSIA. CORSIA, I think in the current phase 1, I think estimate will probably demand will be around 100 million tons. Unfortunately, CORSIA requires letters of authorization, which not many host countries today are ready to provide. Right? So then there is a bottleneck in terms of capacity building needed at host countries to offer LOAs. And then the last one, or maybe I'll break down, is the voluntary carbon market, where corporates have historically been using credits for their carbon neutrality and net zero goals. Here, I think what Dan mentioned around engaging with the greenhouse gas protocol to allow things like market-based accounting in Scope 1 and Scope 3, and engaging with the Science-Based Target Initiative to find a use case for carbon credits and reduction credits, not just removals, for ongoing emissions and beyond value chain mitigation, is going to be important to create that demand signal. Yeah.
For me, I think we need to look beyond just carbon credits. Because for us at GenZero, we look at the carbon markets and carbon credits really as a way of channeling financing to the underlying solutions, not for the credits themselves, right? Credits don't do anything. It is actually the money that's going towards the underlying projects that's going to help us decarbonize. Then the question really is, what is the demand for fundamental decarbonization in these troubled times? Now, I think that part of creating this demand or having this demand paralysis is really about looking at when we have that shift from values to value. So what do I mean by that? Oftentimes we are thinking about the green premium, right? That decarbonized solutions are always a little bit more expensive, a little bit more difficult, far out there. So people have to pay a premium in order to adopt those solutions today. Is that always true? Not really, right? Sometimes now we are actually talking about the green discount because renewable energies at some parts are notwithstanding the tariffs, but renewable energy in most parts would be actually even cheaper than most forms of fossil and even in coal for at least 80–90% of regions. Driving an electric car is not just simply because I want to have avoid internal combustion engine. Today, the running cost of an electric car is actually cheaper because it's cheaper to run on electricity per mile than it is to actually top up with petrol per mile or diesel per mile, right? So actually, many of these things now are actually talking about a green discount, not a green premium. We need to shift that narrative because for too long, if you're just focused on the fact that, oh, you have to do good, but you got to pay a little bit more, it is going to be a very hard sell to the general public and therefore, as a result, to the corporates. But if you tell them that actually this is going to be cheaper, it is more cost effective, you're going to save some money, you're going to do better, and at the same time, do good. then that is a much easier sell. And actually, it's not just about a narrative that we are spinning. It actually is reality today. And we got to find those things which match this and accelerate that push. And I think also internally within GenZero, we are actually taking the view that over the next few years, it is much more important to focus on sources of regulated compliance demand than it is on voluntary demand. Because the urgent will always displace the important. If companies are going to be under pressure from a profitability point of view, you have to ask yourself very tough questions on when and how they are going to be spending their last marginal discretionary dollar.
Could I build on that?
Yeah.
The dynamics that Fred is describing around the green premium or discount, if you look at environmental markets around the world, they tend to do two things. They go really high, hopefully not 1,000, or up to a cap if one exists, or they go to the bottom for exactly these evolutions. And technology curves can vary over time and, in fact, surprise policymakers. And really good regulatory regimes take tending to them like a garden. And there can be price floors that increase with inflation over time. There can be alternative compliance premium caps set on markets, banking rules, and so forth. And I really encourage regulators to study those globally, to find the best, and utilize them to create that sustained price signal.
Yeah. Actually, on price signal, if I can just come in, I would encourage all of us in the room, right, to ask ourselves the question. Okay. So notwithstanding the macro headwinds that we're seeing in the market today, do we fundamentally believe that at some point in time in the future, things have to turn around because climate change is still nevertheless real? Now, if we think that this push away from climate agenda and climate action is permanent state of affairs, nobody's going to believe in investing into climate, investing into decarbonization solutions, then you take one view. But if you believe that notwithstanding some of these turbulence that you're seeing right now, you eventually have to go back to decarbonizing. You eventually have got to sort ourselves out when it comes to emissions. Then the current price dislocation should be an opportunity. We should be asking ourselves, look, if things are now temporarily kind of like uncertain and therefore there's a pricing dislocation, should I buy now? Because at some point in time, I'm going to need it. Should I be locking myself? It's like a forward hedge, right? I mean, like, should I be asking myself, look, if the developers are going to be only delivering credits post-2030, will things have changed? Will there be a reversion back to what is a little bit more normal in the way that we think about the climate? And I will need that, and I can actually get some value by acting today. So this is no longer necessarily just a question around do good, believing in some hunky-dory future, but it is actually a rational economic decision that we have got to make, and those important questions that we've got to ask ourselves.
I agree very much with you the way you've described it, Fred, because we think that decarbonization in an orderly transition manner. What is actually happening right now is we're probably going to see a disorderly transition. So at some point in the future, I don't know if it's in 5 years or in 10 years, but at some point in the future, there's going to be a milestone where we're going to start pricing this into asset values and also carbon pricing. Right?
So we have time for one more question. And this one, I'm kind of going to switch gear a little bit because it comes to a source of, I suppose, capital. How do you think we should bring in corporate philanthropy, and how does it play a bigger role? How do we encourage them to support PDD-FS projects beyond the government and EDB grants?
I think the biggest bang for the buck is not to be in the philanthropic arms, not that there aren't roles for the philanthropies to play, but to get in the core goals that are defined by the C-suite that are delivering the outcomes that we're all talking about here.
Actually, for me, if we are working with philanthropic organizations and other partners, the most important thing that they can do for us is actually to lean in with their capital and say, I'm going to lead with demand. Because they will get something for it, and it's not just a straight-out grant or a subsidy or some philanthropic CSR activity, but they are contributing to a commercially viable theory of change. So if you have got that money and that capital to be able to deploy towards supporting these solutions, rather than give it as an out-out grant, say, look, I'm going to be prepared to stand behind it from a demand signal perspective. I think that will be much more powerful, my sense.
And actually, I think where corporates can really come in and play a role is actually for projects that have a much longer gestation period. So for example, if we look at some of the afforestation and reforestation project where we're looking at, north of 10, 20 years type investment horizons, for corporates to be able to come in and say, I'll give you a 20-year offtake, that has a lot of value for the project developer today. Because the first credits may not even be issued till 5 to 10 years later, and payback period even longer. So this doesn't fit into traditional debt financing vehicles or traditional, closed-ended fund, 10-year fund type models. And corporates coming in can help lengthen that pathway for us. Yeah.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. We'll just sum up with sort of 3 conclusions from our discussion, although there's obviously a lot more behind that. I think the first clearly is we need to think about harmonization to make this region a collective success and harmonization of standards, etc. The second piece of work that we really need to focus on is project financing and how do we sort of help that stage 2, as it were, find sources of capital to make it work. And 3, the public-private partnerships are very critical to making this successful. And we all think that the region, and in Singapore in particular, have potentially the best starting point, as Dan would have pointed out. And we're very hopeful that next year when we come here and sit together again, that we will move beyond these issues and talk about really sort of the scalability of the market. Thank you everyone for listening in, and thank you to my esteemed panelists for a great discussion.